The MMA fighter laughed at the black woman. Then she taught him a lesson he'll never forget. This might be the best story you'll hear today. Enjoy it. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like angry wasps casting harsh shadows across the Chicago gym's worn mats. Sarah Williams adjusted her worn athletic bag on her shoulder, its fabric faded from years of faithful service. Her fingers traced the zipper's metal teeth, a nervous habit she'd developed since returning from overseas. The scent of sweat and determination filled her nostrils, familiar yet foreign. This wasn't the desert compound where she'd earned her stripes. This was civilian territory, and somehow that felt more dangerous. Her reflection caught in the mirror-lined wall, a woman of 42 with graying temples and shoulders that had carried more than their share. The scar above her left eyebrow, barely visible, now told stories she'd never speak aloud. She wore simple, black leggings and a faded army shirt. Nothing flashy, nothing that demanded attention. That was how she preferred it. Invisible, respectful, present but not imposing. The gym buzzed with afternoon energy. Fighters shadowboxed in front of mirrors, their movements sharp and purposeful. Heavy bags swayed under relentless assault. The rhythmic thud of gloves against leather created a percussion that should have felt like home. Sarah had trained in gyms across 3 continents, but somehow this one felt different, uninviting, cold. Sarah approached the front desk, where a young man with bleached hair barely looked up from his phone. "First time?" he asked, his tone suggesting she'd already overstayed her welcome. "Yes, I'd like to sign up for classes." He glanced at her, taking in her age, her quietness, her otherness. "We have beginner classes on Tuesdays, mostly cardio kickboxing, good for people like you." People like you. The phrase hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but her voice remained steady. "I'm looking for mixed martial arts training, sparring, competition prep." The kid laughed, not maliciously, but with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never learned better. "Lady, no offense, but maybe you should start smaller. We've got a community center down the street that does water aerobics." Before Sarah could respond, a voice boomed across the gym, like thunder breaking through a clear sky. "What's this about?" Derek Walsh emerged from the back office, 6 feet 3 inches of manufactured intimidation. Tattoos crawled up his arms. Like ivy on a dead tree, skulls, flames, and words in languages he probably couldn't pronounce. His chest strained against a tank top that proclaimed, "Pain is weakness leaving the body," in bold letters. Everything about him screamed dominance, from his shaved head to his predatory smile. "New member wants to train MMA," the desk clerk explained, smirking. Derek's eyes swept over Sarah like a searchlight, cataloguing everything he saw as inadequate. "MMA!" He crossed his arms, muscles bulging like armor. "Are you sure about that? This isn't some Hollywood movie where the underdog montages their way to victory. This is real combat, real pain, real consequences." Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "I understand what MMA involves." "Do you?" Derek stepped closer, using his height like a weapon. "Because I see a middle-aged woman who probably hasn't thrown a real punch in her life. What is this, some midlife crisis thing, trying to prove you're still young?" The words cut deep, but Sarah's expression remained unchanged. She'd learned long ago that showing pain only invited more of it. "I'd like to pay for a month's membership." Derek's laughter was ugly, infectious. Other gym members began to notice the commotion drifting closer, like vultures sensing carrion. "Sweetheart, I'm trying to save you from embarrassment and hospital bills. Why don't you try something more and appropriate? There's a Curves down the street. Or maybe yoga, I hear, that's very meditative." The gathering crowd chuckled appreciatively. Sarah felt their eyes on her like needles, each glance a small puncture wound. She'd faced enemy fire with less anxiety than this moment of civilian judgment. "I can handle myself," she said quietly. "Can you?" Derek's voice carried across the gym, now ensuring everyone could hear his performance. "Because handling yourself in a Pilates class is different from handling yourself when someone's trying to choke you unconscious." He gestured broadly to his audience of sycophants. "Look, I admire the confidence. I really do. But there's confidence and there's delusion. And what I'm seeing here is pure, unadulterated delusion." Sarah's hands remained steady at her sides, but her father's voice echoed in her mind. Let them underestimate you, baby girl. It's the only advantage you'll ever need. The humiliation continued with surgical precision. Derek assigned her to beginners' drills, while advanced fighters worked mere feet away their competence, a constant reminder of where she supposedly belonged. During her first week, he made her practice basic stances while narrating her every mistake. To anyone within earshot. See how she's dropping her guard. That's what happens when you start training after your prime. Bad habits are harder to break when you're seasoned. The other students laughed, but it wasn't joyful laughter. It was the uncomfortable laughter of people relieved they weren't the target, grateful for someone else's misery. During partner drills, Derek paired her with Marcus, a heavyweight who treated her like porcelain. Don't hurt the lady, Derek instructed loudly. We don't want any lawsuits if she breaks a hip. Marcus, uncomfortable but compliant, pulled every punch telegraphed. Every move. The careful choreography was more insulting than actual contact would have been. Sarah was being treated like a child playing dress-up, not a student learning to fight. The psychological warfare extended beyond training. In the locker room, conversations stopped when she entered. Whispered comments followed her exit. What's she trying to prove? My grandmother moves faster. Someone should tell her this isn't a retirement hobby. The worst part wasn't the mockery. It was the silence from potential allies. Other women at the gym existed in their own precarious positions, afraid to defend her lest they become targets themselves. They averted their eyes when Derek made his jokes complicit in their silence. But the cruelest cut came during her second week when Derek announced team selections for an upcoming intergym competition. Names were called with ceremony, each selection met with congratulations and backslapping. Sarah waited, knowing her name wouldn't be called, but hoping anyway. And that's our team, Derek concluded. The best this gym has to offer. People who've earned their place through blood, sweat, and actual talent. The unspoken message was clear. She was none of those things. One evening, as Sarah gathered her things after another humiliating session, Derek approached with his signature predatory smile. Hey, no hard feelings about the team selection. It's just business. You know, can't have passengers when we're trying. To win. Sarah looked up from her bag, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't expect to be selected. Good. That shows you're realistic. He leaned against a locker, blocking her exit. But here's the thing. I've been thinking about your situation. Maybe there's a way you can contribute without actually fighting. Her stomach clenched with anticipation of whatever fresh humiliation was coming. We could use someone to help with equipment maintenance, clean the mats after training, maybe help with registration at events. He paused, savoring the moment. Think of it as finding your proper level, your actual contribution. The offer hung in the air like a noose. Sarah understood the subtext. Accept your place as a servant, or leave entirely. Either way, abandon any pretense of being an equal. For the first time since entering the gym, her composure cracked slightly. Her voice came out smaller than intended. I came here to train. And you are training, Derek replied smoothly. You're learning about reality, about knowing your limitations. That's the most important lesson any fighter can learn. He walked away, leaving her alone with the echo of his laughter and the weight of her own inadequacy. But something else stirred in that moment. Not defeat, but recognition. She'd felt this before in other hostile territories, surrounded by other men who'd mistaken her quiet dignity for weakness. That night, Sarah sat in her small apartment, clutching her father's dog tags like a rosary. The metal was warm from her touch, worn smooth by decades of similar desperate moments. Master Sergeant Theodore Williams had given her these tags before. His final deployment, along with advice that had kept her alive through 2 tours of duty. Baby girl, some fights you win with fists. Others you win by being smarter than everyone who underestimates you. Tomorrow would bring more humiliation, more laughter, more carefully crafted cruelty. But tonight, for the first time since entering that gym, Sarah Williams smiled. Because Derek Walsh had made one crucial mistake, he'd assumed her silence meant surrender. He was about to learn the difference between quiet and broken. And in a gym full of people who'd mistaken her restraint for weakness, that lesson was going to be unforgettable. Derek's campaign of humiliation escalated with each passing day, his creativity and cruelty seemingly boundless. During sparring sessions, he'd position himself where Sarah could see him mimicking her movements, with exaggerated clumsiness, drawing snickers from his loyal audience. When she practiced strikes on the heavy bag, he'd time his own sessions to coincide, demonstrating the proper technique with theatrical flair. "See the difference," he'd announce to anyone within earshot. "Power comes from the whole body, not just pushing the bag around like you're rearranging furniture." The psychological torture was methodical. Derek had identified every pressure point of her insecurity and pressed them with surgical precision. When she struggled with a complex combination, he'd shake his head sadly. "Some people just don't have the coordination for this sport. It's not their fault. You can't teach natural ability." But the worst humiliation came during a particularly crowded evening session. Derek called for a demonstration of proper defensive positioning, scanning the room before his eyes settled on Sarah with predatory satisfaction. "Sarah, come up here. You need the practice more than anyone." The request was framed as concern, but everyone heard the underlying message. She was the example of what not to do, the cautionary tale in athletic form. Heart-pounding, she stepped onto the mat, feeling dozens of eyes cataloguing her every flaw. "Now show everyone your guard position," Derek instructed, circling her like a shark scenting blood. Sarah raised her hands, muscle memory from countless hours of real combat training taking over. Her stance was solid, balanced, textbook perfect, but Derek wasn't interested in accuracy. "See how tense she is. Fighting isn't about being rigid, it's about flowing like water." He pushed her shoulder lightly and she adjusted accordingly. "And see how she flinches. That's what happens when you start training after your reflexes have declined." The crowd's laughter felt like hot needles against her skin, but worse than the mockery was the realization that several of them genuinely believed Derek's assessment. They saw what he wanted them to see: a middle-aged woman playing at being something she wasn't. After the demonstration, as students paired off for drills, Sarah found herself partnered with Jake, a young fighter whose apologetic expression made the situation even more degrading. He pulled his punches so obviously that their sparring resembled a choreographed dance more than combat training. "You can hit harder," Sarah told him quietly. Jake glanced nervously toward Derek, who was watching with amusement. "I don't want to hurt you, ma'am." "Ma'am." The word stung more than any punch could have. She wasn't a fellow fighter deserving of respect. She was a fragile elder to be handled with kid gloves. Later in the locker room, Sarah overheard a conversation that crystallized her growing isolation. "I almost feel bad for her," one woman whispered to another. "She seems nice enough. But why is she here? I mean, what's she trying to prove? Midlife crisis, probably. My aunt started doing CrossFit at 50 and nearly killed herself trying to keep up with people half her age. At least CrossFit won't. It'll leave you unconscious on a mat." The women meant no harm, but their pity was almost worse than Derek's cruelty. They saw her as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened when self-awareness failed to match ambition. That evening, Sarah called her daughter Rebecca for the first time in weeks. The conversation started normally, work, weather, mutual acquaintances, but eventually her carefully maintained composure began to crack. "Mom, you sound tired," Rebecca observed. "How's the gym thing going?" Sarah stared at her reflection in her apartment window, seeing a woman who looked older than her years, defeated by circumstances she couldn't explain. "It's challenging." "Are you sure this is what you want to be doing? I mean, there are other ways to stay active, safer ways." Even her own daughter couldn't see her as anything more than a middle-aged woman chasing an impossible dream. The realization hit like a physical blow, leaving her breathless and alone in her small apartment. Sleep came fitfully that night, filled with dreams of desert compounds and the echoes of her father's voice. "The hardest battles aren't against the enemy in front of you, baby girl. They're against the voice in your head that says you don't belong on the battlefield." But for the first time since returning from deployment, Sarah wasn't sure she belonged anywhere at all. The breaking point came during her third week when Derek announced a special training session focusing on real-world combat scenarios. The advanced students would demonstrate techniques while beginners observed and learned. It was educational. Theater with Sarah cast as the unwilling comic relief. For this demonstration, "We need someone to play the role of the victim," Derek announced, his eyes finding Sarah with laser precision. "Someone who might actually find themselves in a situation where they need to defend themselves." The implication was clear. She wasn't learning to be a fighter. She was learning to survive as a victim. The distinction was crucial and deliberately humiliating. As Derek positioned her for the demonstration, his grip on her wrist was firmer. Than necessary, his instructions delivered with condescending patience. "Now, Sarah, when someone grabs you like this, your instinct might be to panic. But we're going to teach you some basic escapes that even someone with limited training can execute." The demonstration proceeded with Derek manhandling her while explaining each technique to the fascinated audience. He was careful never to actually hurt her. That would have legal implications, but the psychological damage was surgical in its precision. "See how she's freezing up. That's natural for someone who's never experienced real aggression. In a real situation, this kind of panic could be fatal." When the session ended, Sarah remained on the mat for a moment longer than necessary, her body shaking not from exertion, but from the accumulated weight of weeks of systematic humiliation. Around her, students dispersed with casual conversations about weekend plans and upcoming competitions, the normal interactions of a community she would never truly join. But as she gathered her things, something shifted in her chest. Not defeat, recognition. She'd felt this exact combination of isolation and underestimation before in forward operating bases, where her presence was tolerated but never welcomed, where her competence was constantly questioned, despite her record. The difference was that in those situations, she'd had a mission, a purpose that transcended the opinions of small-minded men. Here, she'd been allowing their judgment to define her reality. That night, Sarah sat in her apartment with her father's service records spread across her coffee table, commendations, deployment orders, photographs of a man who'd never let anyone's expectations limit his potential. His voice seemed to speak directly from those faded documents. "The enemy's greatest weapon isn't bullets, baby girl. It's making you forget who you are." For weeks she'd been fighting Derek's war on his terms, accepting his definitions of her capabilities. But wars weren't won by accepting the enemy's assessment of your strength. As dawn broke over Chicago, Sarah Williams began planning her real campaign. The transformation began in silence and shadows. While Derek held court during peak hours, Sarah arrived before dawn and stayed after closing, using the empty gym to rediscover muscles and instincts that civilian life had allowed to dormant. The heavy bag became her confessor, absorbing the frustration and fury she couldn't express during regular hours. Her apartment became a training ground of memory and muscle, push-ups on hardwood floors, shadow boxing in front of mirrors that reflected not a middle-aged woman past her prime, but a soldier rediscovering her warrior's heart. She studied videos of advanced techniques with the same intensity she'd once applied to enemy reconnaissance, breaking down movements frame by frame. The physical conditioning was only part of her preparation. Sarah began observing Derek with the analytical precision she'd once reserved for high-value targets. His techniques were impressive but predictable, his strength substantial but unfocused. He fought like a man who'd never faced truly dangerous opposition, all aggression and showmanship, with fundamental gaps that real combat would exploit mercilessly. More importantly, she recognized his psychological patterns. Derek was a performer who fed on audience reaction, his confidence tied directly to external validation. Remove the crowd, challenge his assumptions, and his entire persona would crumble like a house of cards. During regular training sessions, Sarah maintained her facade of struggling incompetence. She missed combinations she could execute flawlessly. In private, stumbled through drills she'd mastered decades ago and accepted Derek's corrections with humble gratitude. Each act of deliberate failure felt like swallowing glass, but it served a larger purpose. "You're improving," Derek told her one evening, his tone suggesting surprise that evolution was possible at her advanced age. Still a long way to go, but improvement nonetheless. Sarah nodded respectfully, hiding the smile that threatened to crack. Her carefully maintained mask. Let him believe his own mythology. Let him think her progress was due to his superior instruction rather than her own midnight resurrections of forgotten skills. The gym's social dynamics began to shift subtly. Other students initially entertained by Derek's performance were starting to show signs of discomfort with the ongoing harassment. Nothing dramatic, averted eyes during particularly cruel moments, awkward silences when his jokes fell flat, but enough to suggest that his behavior was creating cracks in his kingdom of admirers. Sarah filed these observations away like intelligence, reports mapping the human terrain as carefully as she'd once mapped hostile territories. Every person in that gym had pressure points, insecurities, and moments of doubt that could be leveraged when the time came. But her most important preparation was internal. In the desert, she'd learned to compartmentalize fear, pain, and doubt into manageable sections of her consciousness. Now she applied that same mental discipline to Derek's psychological warfare, treating his insults as external weather rather than personal verdicts. The woman who'd entered that gym seeking acceptance had been defeated by her own need for approval. The woman who emerged from weeks of secret training had transcended that need entirely. Sarah Williams was preparing for war, and in war, the enemy's opinion was irrelevant. Late one evening, as she practiced combinations in the empty gym, her reflection caught her attention. The person in the mirror moved with fluid precision, every strike delivered with intent and power. This wasn't the struggling amateur Derek saw during regular hours. This was the operator who'd earned commendations in 2 theaters of war. The disconnect was startling and liberating. For weeks, she'd been trying to become someone Derek would respect, accepting his assessment of her limitations. But respect wasn't something to be earned from small men with smaller minds. It was something to be claimed through demonstration of undeniable competence. Her phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "How's the gym going, Mom? Still enjoying it?" Sarah stared at the message for a long moment before responding, "Learning a lot about myself." It wasn't a lie. She was learning that years of civilian life had made her forget fundamental truths about power, respect, and the difference between being underestimated and being weak. Derek Walsh thought he was breaking down a middle-aged woman's delusions of grandeur. In reality, he was awakening something far more dangerous than he could possibly imagine. The announcement came on a Thursday evening, delivered with Derek's characteristic theatrical flair. The gym would be hosting an open demonstration event showcasing various martial arts disciplines for the community. Local media would attend, potential sponsors would be watching, and, most importantly for Derek's ego, there would be opportunities for gym members to demonstrate their skills in front of a real audience. "This is what we've been training for," Derek announced to the assembled students. "A chance to show the community what real martial arts looks like, what real fighters can accomplish." Sarah listened from the back of the group, understanding immediately that this event represented everything she'd been excluded from: recognition, respect, belonging. It was the crystallization of Derek's judgment that she would never be worthy of public representation. But as Derek outlined the demonstration format, Sarah recognized an opportunity that he couldn't possibly foresee. The event would include open sparring sessions where community members could observe real martial arts in action. Volunteers would be needed to demonstrate various techniques and applications. "Now I know everyone's excited," Derek continued, "but let's be realistic about who should participate. This is about representing our gym's reputation. We need our best people showing what we're capable of." His eyes swept the room, deliberately skipping over Sarah as if she were invisible. The message was clear. This was for real fighters, not weekend warriors playing dress-up. After the meeting, as students excitedly discussed their potential roles in the demonstration, Sarah approached Derek with carefully calibrated humility. "Derek, I understand I wouldn't be suitable for demonstrations, but would it be possible for me to volunteer in some other capacity, maybe helping with setup or registration?" Derek's smile was patronizing, but pleased. Here was confirmation of his successful management of her expectations. "Absolutely, Sarah. That's exactly the kind of contribution we need from someone at your level. Very realistic thinking." But behind her deferential expression, Sarah was calculating angles and opportunities with tactical precision. She needed to be at that event, needed to be present when the moment came to demonstrate exactly what Derek had failed to recognize for all these weeks. Actually, she said as if the thought had just occurred to her. "Would it be possible for me to participate in some of the beginner demonstrations? Nothing advanced, just basic techniques. I know I'm not ready for anything sophisticated, but it might help other newcomers see that everyone has to start somewhere." Derek considered this request with the benevolent condescension of a king granting a peasant's petition. Having her perform basic techniques badly would actually reinforce his narrative about realistic expectations and proper assessment of abilities. "You know what, that's not a bad idea. Show people what beginning training looks like. Set appropriate expectations." He nodded approvingly. "Just remember, this is about representing the gym's standards. Don't try anything beyond your capabilities." Sarah thanked him with appropriate gratitude, but internally she was smiling for the first time in weeks. Derek had just granted her exactly what she needed: a public platform and his explicit permission to demonstrate her capabilities. That night she made a call she'd been avoiding for months, to Colonel Martinez, her former commanding officer, and the person who'd written her commendation for actions in Syria that remained classified but had earned her recognition at the highest levels of military command. "Sarah Williams," Martinez said, his voice carrying warmth she'd forgotten existed. "I was wondering when you'd call. How's civilian life treating you?" They talked for over an hour about transitions, challenges, and the unique difficulties faced by operators trying to find their place in a world that had no context for their capabilities. Martinez listened without judgment as Sarah described her experiences at the gym, the systematic undermining of her confidence, and her growing sense of invisibility. "You know what your problem is, Williams," Martinez said finally. "You're trying to be someone else. The woman I deployed with didn't give a damn what anyone thought about her capabilities. She let her actions do the talking. That woman had a uniform and a mission that validated her presence. That woman had training and competence that existed independent of anyone's validation. The uniform didn't make you dangerous, Sarah. It just gave you permission to show how dangerous you already were." After the call, Sarah sat in her apartment surrounded by the artifacts of her military service. Commendations, photographs, equipment that told the story of a person Derek couldn't possibly imagine. Tomorrow would bring another day of careful incompetence, but the day after that would bring something entirely different. The demonstration was scheduled for Saturday afternoon. By Sunday morning, everyone in that gym would understand exactly who Sarah Williams had always been. Have you ever experienced or known someone who has experienced systematic underestimation or bullying? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Friday evening's training session carried an electric anticipation. As students prepared for the next day's demonstration, Derek moved through the gym like a general reviewing troops, offering last-minute advice and building excitement for the public showcase of their skills. Sarah trained quietly in her usual corner, practicing basic combinations with deliberate imperfection, while secretly observing the advanced students' techniques. She'd memorized every fighter's strengths and weaknesses, catalogued their preferences and patterns, and identified the gaps in their training that real combat would expose mercilessly. "Remember, everyone," Derek announced as the session wound down, "tomorrow is about showing the community what real martial arts looks like, what real dedication and training can accomplish." He paused dramatically, ensuring he had everyone's attention. "Some of you have been training for years. Others are just beginning their journey. But everyone here has earned their place through commitment and progress." His eyes found Sarah, and his smile carried calculated kindness. "Even our beginners will have a chance to show where this journey starts." "Right, Sarah?" She nodded gratefully, playing her role perfectly. "Thank you for the opportunity. Just remember what we discussed. Stay within your abilities. This isn't about trying to be something you're not." The other students chuckled good-naturedly, seeing Derek's management of expectations as wisdom rather than cruelty. They genuinely believed they were witnessing proper mentorship, the careful shepherding of an overambitious student back to appropriate limitations. After the session, as Sarah gathered her things, she overheard Derek talking to his inner circle of advanced students. "Look, I feel bad for her sometimes, but someone has to be realistic. Can you imagine if we'd let her get in over her head? The liability alone could shut us down. She seems nice enough, offered Marcus, the heavyweight who'd been her consistently gentle sparring partner. Nice isn't dangerous, Derek replied. And this sport is about being dangerous. Some people have it, others don't. The trick is knowing which category you're in. Sarah left the gym for the last time as an unknown quantity. When she returned tomorrow, everything would change. Saturday morning dawned crisp and clear, Chicago's autumn air, carrying the promise of transformation. Sarah woke before her alarm, her body humming with anticipation and nerves that reminded her of pre-mission briefings in hostile territories. She'd faced armed insurgents with less anxiety than this civilian demonstration, but the stakes felt equally high. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a woman transformed by weeks of secret preparation. The soft edges of civilian life had been carved away, revealing the lean competence that had once made her invaluable to military operations. Her eyes held a focus that Derek had never bothered to notice, the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen combat and emerged stronger. She dressed carefully, plain black athletic wear that wouldn't draw attention. Her father's dog tags tucked beneath her shirt, where they could rest against her heart. No makeup, no jewelry, nothing that suggested performance or vanity. She was preparing for war, not theater. The gym buzzed with pre-event energy when she arrived. Local media representatives tested equipment, while potential sponsors toured the facilities. Community members filtered in with curious expressions drawn by advertisements promising an authentic demonstration of martial arts excellence. Derek held court near the main mat, resplendent in his gym's official coaching attire, and clearly energized by the attention. He moved with the confident swagger of a man in his element, greeting visitors and explaining the day's format with practiced showmanship. "Today you'll see what real training produces," he told a reporter. "These aren't movie stunts or choreographed demonstrations. This is authentic martial arts demonstrated by serious athletes who've dedicated themselves to mastering these disciplines." Sarah helped arrange chairs and distribute programs invisible in her service role, but strategically positioned to observe every detail of the gym's layout and crowd dynamics. She noted the camera positions, identified key spectators, and mentally rehearsed the moment that would soon transform everything. The demonstrations began with advanced students showcasing complex techniques to appreciative applause. Derek narrated each performance with obvious pride, highlighting years of training and natural talent that had produced such impressive results. "What you're seeing here represents hundreds of hours of dedicated practice," he explained to the audience. "These aren't natural gifts. They're earned through discipline, commitment, and proper instruction." The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. Derek genuinely believed that visible training was the only training that mattered, that official recognition was required for competence to exist. He lived in a small world where his gym was the center of the martial arts universe. As the morning progressed, demonstrations moved from advanced techniques to intermediate skills, each performance met with enthusiastic applause from an audience clearly impressed by the display of athleticism and precision. Finally, Derek called for the beginner demonstrations, his tone shifting to paternal encouragement. "Now we'll show you where everyone starts, the foundation techniques that every martial artist must master before advancing to more sophisticated applications." His eyes found Sarah in the crowd. "Sarah, you're up. Show everyone what beginning training looks like." The moment had arrived. Sarah walked to the center of the mat with steady steps, feeling dozens of eyes cataloging her age, her unremarkable appearance, her obvious amateur status. The audience settled into polite attention, prepared to witness exactly what Derek had promised, a demonstration of where the martial arts journey begins. But Sarah wasn't beginning anything. She was ending a charade that had lasted far too long. Derek joined her on the mat, positioning himself as the instructor who would guide her through basic techniques. "Now Sarah's been training with us for several weeks, and she's made good progress given her starting point. We'll demonstrate some fundamental strikes and defensive positions." The audience waited patiently, cameras rolled, and the gym's reputation hung in the balance of what everyone expected to be a routine demonstration of basic competence. Sarah removed her warm-up jacket, revealing for the first time the faded tattoo on her left shoulder, the Special Forces insignia that she'd kept hidden through weeks of careful deception. The image was small and understated, but several audience members recognized its significance immediately. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Derek, focused on his performance, didn't notice the shift in atmosphere as people began to understand that something unexpected was about to occur. "Ready, Sarah?" Derek asked, positioning himself for the first demonstration. She looked at him with eyes that had seen combat across 2 continents, survived operations that remained classified, and earned commendations from commanders who'd witnessed her capabilities under the most extreme conditions possible. "I've been ready for weeks," she replied quietly. And then, with the fluid precision of muscle memory activated by necessity, Sarah Williams stopped pretending to be someone she wasn't. The demonstration that followed lasted less than 3 minutes, but transformed every assumption that had been made about who belonged in that gym and what real competence looked like when it stopped hiding behind false modesty. When Derek hit the mat for the final time, the silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was reverent. The audience had just witnessed something authentic in a world of manufactured performances, something real in a space dedicated to artificial displays of strength. Sarah stood over Derek's prone form, breathing steadily, completely in control. For the first time in weeks, she spoke with her own voice, rather than the deferential whisper she'd used to navigate his world. "You spent weeks trying to convince me that I didn't belong here, that my age, my gender, my appearance disqualified me from being taken seriously as a martial artist." Her voice carried clearly across the silent gym. "But you made one crucial mistake. You assumed that your recognition was required for my competence to exist." She held up her father's dog tags, letting them catch the light. "I learned to fight in places where incompetence meant death, where there were no second chances, no do-overs, no opportunity to quit when things got difficult. I faced enemies who would eat everyone in this gym for breakfast and still have room for lunch." The audience was completely silent now, understanding that they were witnessing something far more significant than a martial arts demonstration. This was a reckoning, a moment when hidden truth emerged to challenge comfortable assumptions. "The lesson here isn't about martial arts," Sarah continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned the right to speak about real combat. "It's about the danger of judging people based on what you see rather than what you know. About the mistake of confusing quiet dignity with weakness." She looked around the gym, meeting the eyes of students who'd watched her humiliation in silence, spectators who'd come expecting entertainment, media representatives who'd found a story they never could have anticipated. Some of the most dangerous people in the world are the ones you'd never suspect, the ones who don't need to advertise their capabilities because they've proven them in places that matter more than any gym, any competition, any demonstration. Derek struggled to his feet, his face flushed with humiliation and anger. But before he could speak, Sarah turned to address him directly. "Thank you for the lesson in humility, for reminding me that other people's limitations aren't my own, and for giving me the opportunity to remember who I am when I stop trying to be who you think I should be." The gym erupted, not in laughter or mockery, but in recognition of something authentic and powerful. The applause started slowly building to a standing ovation that acknowledged not just her physical demonstration, but her courage in revealing truth after weeks of careful concealment. Later, as the crowd dispersed and equipment was stored away, several advanced students approached Sarah with expressions of respect and curiosity. The same people who'd watched her humiliation in silence now wanted to understand her background, learn from her experience, and train alongside someone whose competence had been proven rather than simply claimed. Derek, to his credit, approached her before she left. His ego was bruised but not broken, his understanding of the world expanded by an experience that had challenged every assumption he'd made. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I made judgments based on... I don't know what I based them on. Prejudice, I guess. Assumptions that had nothing to do with who you actually are." Sarah studied his face, seeing genuine remorse rather than calculated public relations. "The apology I accept, but understand that this wasn't about proving anything to you. This was about remembering who I am regardless of who you thought I was." She paused, considering whether to extend an olive branch or simply walk away clean. The woman who'd entered this gym weeks ago would have chosen peace over principle. But that woman had been defeated by her own need for acceptance. If you're serious about learning from this, then learn this: competence doesn't announce itself. The most dangerous people are often the quietest ones, and respect isn't something you grant based on appearances. It's something you earn by recognizing worth regardless of packaging. Derek nodded slowly, the lesson sinking deeper than his wounded pride. Would you consider staying training with us properly this time? Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile she'd worn in that gym. I think I'll look for a place that judges fighters by their skills rather than their demographics. But thank you for the offer. As she gathered her things for the final time, several students approached with genuine curiosity about her background and training methods. Witty tea. Conversations were different now, respectful exchanges between equals, rather than patronizing attempts at inclusion. Marcus, her gentle sparring partner from previous weeks, shook his head in amazement. I can't believe I was pulling my punches with you all this time. You were being kind, Sarah replied. That's not something to apologize for. But I was treating you like you were fragile. You were treating me like you thought I was fragile. There's a difference. One is about protection, the other is about perception. The local news crew, initially planning a simple community interest story, found themselves with something far more compelling. The reporter approached Sarah with questions about her military background and the broader implications of her demonstration. What message do you hope people take from what happened here today? The reporter asked. Sarah considered the question, carefully aware that her words would reach beyond the gym's walls to touch other people, fighting their own battles for recognition and respect. Don't let other people's limitations become your own, she said finally. And don't mistake someone's quiet dignity for weakness. Some of the strongest people you'll ever meet are the ones who don't need to prove their strength to strangers. The story that aired that evening focused not on the dramatic demonstration, but on the broader themes of assumptions, prejudice, and the danger of judging competence by appearance. It sparked conversations across Chicago about similar experiences, people who'd been underestimated, dismissed, or marginalized based on factors unrelated to their actual capabilities. Sarah's phone buzzed with messages from old military contacts who'd seen the coverage, expressing pride and offering opportunities to train with more enlightened organizations. Rebecca called, her voice filled with amazement and newfound respect for her mother's hidden depths. Mom, I had no idea, Rebecca said. I mean, I knew about your service, but seeing you actually... Wow, I'm sorry I suggested you find safer hobbies. You were protecting me, Sarah replied. Just like I was protecting you from worrying about things that happened long ago in places far away. But you never stopped being that person, did you? The soldier. Sarah looked around her apartment, seeing the artifacts of military service with new eyes. I tried to. I thought civilian life meant leaving that part of myself behind, but some things are too fundamental to abandon just because the uniform comes off. The conversation with her daughter lasted hours, bridging gaps that had formed during Sarah's difficult transition to civilian life. For the first time, she could share stories of her experiences without feeling like she was burdening someone with incomprehensible realities. Over the following days, opportunities emerged that Sarah hadn't expected. A veterans organization reached out about starting a self-defense program for women transitioning from military service. A local community college inquired about her interest in teaching adaptive martial arts to students with disabilities. Most surprisingly, a high-end training facility contacted her about joining their instructor team, specifically seeking someone with real-world combat experience. But the most meaningful contact came from other women who'd seen the news coverage and recognized their own struggles in Sarah's story. They shared experiences of being underestimated in boardrooms, dismissed in athletic competitions, and marginalized in male-dominated spaces simply because they didn't fit expected profiles of competence. One woman wrote, "Watching you reminded me that I don't need anyone's permission to be qualified for my job. I've been apologizing for my expertise for years, trying to make other people comfortable with my capabilities. No more." Another shared, "I've been letting my teenage son's friends treat me like I'm invisible because I'm a single mom who works in an office. They have no idea I have a black belt and could probably handle all of them at once. Maybe it's time they learned some respect. The messages kept coming. Teachers who'd stopped challenging difficult administrators, athletes who'd accepted lesser positions to avoid conflict, professionals who'd minimized their achievements to avoid seeming threatening. Sarah's demonstration had given them permission to reclaim aspects of themselves they'd suppressed for the comfort of others. 2 weeks later, Sarah found herself in a new gym, one that evaluated fighters based on skill rather than demographics. The owner, a former Navy SEAL, had specifically recruited her after seeing the news coverage. "We don't care what you look like or how old you are," he told her during their initial meeting. "We care whether you can fight and whether you can teach others to fight. Everything else is irrelevant." The training environment was completely different from Derek's gym. Students were evaluated on competence and effort rather than conformity to expected profiles. Age, gender, and background were simply data points rather than disqualifying factors. During her first sparring session, Sarah found herself matched against a former collegiate wrestler half her age. The young man approached the match with respect and intensity, treating her as a legitimate opponent, rather than a fragile elder requiring careful handling. The session was bruising and challenging and absolutely exhilarating. For the first time in months, Sarah felt truly alive, pushing her limits against someone who respected her enough to test those limits honestly. Afterward, her sparring partner extended his hand with genuine appreciation. "That was awesome. Where did you learn that submission technique, Nasiria?" Sarah replied simply, and his eyes widened with new understanding. "Would you be willing to show me some of those applications? I've never trained with anyone who's used these techniques in actual combat." The conversation that followed was the kind Sarah had been seeking since leaving the military. Technical, discussion between professionals sharing knowledge and experience without judgment or condescension. She was valued for her expertise rather than tolerated, despite her appearance. 6 months later, Sarah was teaching 3 classes a week and had been promoted to senior instructor. Her students ranged from former military personnel seeking to maintain their edge to complete beginners learning their first techniques. What they all shared was respect for competence regardless of its packaging. Derek visited the new gym one afternoon ostensibly to cross-train but clearly seeking some form of closure from their previous encounter. Sarah greeted him cordially without animosity or triumph. "You look good," he said, observing her obvious comfort in the new environment. "Happy?" "I am," Sarah replied honestly. "This is what I was looking for all along, a place where capability matters more than appearance." Derek watched her lead a class through advanced techniques, noting the obvious respect her students showed and the quiet authority she wielded, through demonstrated competence rather than manufactured intimidation. "I've been thinking about what you said," he told her after the class, "about judging people by what I see rather than what I know. I've made some changes at my gym, trying to be more inclusive, more open to people who don't fit my preconceptions." Sarah smiled, recognizing the genuine effort behind his words. "That's good to hear. Everyone deserves the chance to show what they're capable of. I owe you for that lesson. It was harder to learn than I expected, but more important than I realized." They parted on good terms, 2 people who'd learned from a difficult encounter and emerged better for the experience. Derek returned to his gym with expanded understanding, while Sarah continued building the community she'd always been seeking. A year after the demonstration that changed everything, Sarah received an invitation that brought her story full circle. A women's military veterans organization was hosting a conference on successful civilian transitions, and they wanted her to speak about finding purpose and identity after service. Standing before an audience of women who understood the unique challenges of translating military competence into civilian recognition, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The hardest part of leaving the military wasn't losing the structure or the mission, she told them. It was learning to value my own capabilities, independent of external validation. For months, I let other people's limitations become my limitations. I accepted their assessment of my worth instead of remembering my own. She paused, thinking of Derek's gym and the woman she'd been when she first walked through those doors, seeking acceptance rather than demanding respect. But here's what I learned. Competence doesn't expire when you take off the uniform. Training doesn't become invalid because someone can't recognize it, and your worth isn't determined by whether someone else can see it. The audience nodded. With recognition, women who'd fought similar battles in boardrooms and classrooms and countless other civilian spaces where their military experience was seen as irrelevant or even detrimental. The victory isn't in proving them wrong, Sarah continued. It's in remembering who you are regardless of who they think you are. It's in finding places and people who value substance over stereotypes. And it's in understanding that the most dangerous person in any room is often the one everyone underestimates. After her speech, Sarah was approached by dozens of women sharing their own stories of transition recognition and the ongoing battle to claim space in a world that often couldn't see their capabilities. One young veteran recently separated from the Air Force grabbed Sarah's hands with desperate intensity. I needed to hear this. I've been making myself smaller, quieter, less threatening because I thought that's what civilian life required. But you're right. I don't need anyone's permission to be competent. Another woman, a former Marine struggling in a corporate environment, said simply, "Thank you for reminding me that their blindness isn't my weakness." The conversations continued late into the evening, women connecting across branches of service and decades of experience united by the shared challenge of translating military excellence into civilian success. As Sarah drove home through Chicago's familiar streets, she thought about the journey that had led her from Derek's gym to this moment of purpose and recognition. The woman who'd entered that gym seeking acceptance had been replaced by someone who understood that acceptance from the wrong people was worthless, while respect from the right people was invaluable. Her phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. Saw the conference coverage online, so proud of who you've become, Mum, or maybe who you always were and finally remembered. Sarah smiled, pulling into her apartment complex as the sun set over a city that had witnessed her transformation from invisible to undeniable. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students to train, new opportunities to demonstrate that competence comes in packages the world often fails to recognize. But tonight, she was simply Sarah Williams, veteran instructor and living proof that the most powerful people are often the ones you'd never suspect until the moment they decide to stop hiding their strength behind others' expectations. The lesson that began in humiliation had ended in triumph not over Derek or his gym, but over the parts of herself that had accepted other people's definitions of her limitations. She'd learned to value her own capabilities, independent of external recognition, to find communities that celebrated competence rather than conformity, and to remember that true strength often wears the mask of quiet dignity. In a world quick to judge by appearances, Sarah Williams had become living proof that the most dangerous assumption is underestimating the person who seems the least threatening. And in teaching that lesson, she'd found not just respect but purpose, the missing piece that had eluded her since leaving the military. Some battles are won with fists, others are won by simply refusing to accept defeat. Sarah Williams had won both, and in doing so had shown others that their own victories were possible, one quiet demonstration of competence at a time. The warrior had never left. She'd simply learned when to reveal herself and to whom, and that timing, that discretion, that strategic patience, those were perhaps the most dangerous weapons of all. In the end, respect isn't something to be earned from those who refuse to see your worth. It's something to be claimed by those who recognize it, shared with those who appreciate it, and demonstrated to those who need to learn that their assumptions might be the most dangerous opponents they'll ever face. You are amazing. If you genuinely enjoyed this story, please leave a like and subscribe. It's a great feedback for me. If it made you feel seen, heard, or simply reminded you that change is still possible, share it with someone who needs a little hope today. See you.